They said I wasn't their kind of neighbor. I didn't realize those 7 words would flip my life upside down, or that I would eventually be the one to burn their perfect little empire to the ground. But that's exactly what happened, and believe me, once I started pulling on their secrets, the whole HOA board came crashing down like a rotten house of cards. At first, I thought it was just another misunderstanding. I had just moved into the neighborhood, a quiet suburban street with neatly trimmed lawns, polished SUVs, and smiles that felt painted on. My house wasn't flashy, but it was mine. I worked hard for it. On the second week, I received my first friendly reminder letter from the HOA. The paper was almost polite, almost. It told me my trash bins had been improperly aligned and that my mailbox was an T in compliance with community standards. I brushed it off. Everyone gets one of those, right? But then came the second letter, and the third. Suddenly, I wasn't being asked to move a trash can. I was being told my paint shade wasn't approved, my grass wasn't green enough, and even the flowers my late mother planted weren't aesthetic. That ass when I noticed something, no one else around me seemed to be getting these letters. Their fences leaned, their lawns had weeds, but only I was out of compliance. The real blow came at the next HOA meeting. I walked into that sterile, fluorescent-lit room and saw the board. 5 smug faces behind a long table, shuffling papers like judges in some kangaroo court. The president, a silver-haired man named Richard, leaned forward and smiled with the kind of smile wolves give before they bite. He said, "You just don't seem like our kind of neighbor." That phrase echoed in my mind long after the meeting ended. It wasn't about trash bins, mailboxes, or flowers. It was about me. They didn't want me there. But instead of leaving quietly, I decided to dig. And that's when the story really begins. Weeks passed, and I became obsessed. Every letter they sent me, I saved. Every fine they tried to slap on me, I documented. I showed up to meetings with a recorder in my pocket. At first, they laughed at me. They thought I was just some stubborn outsider who'd eventually fold. But what they didn't know was that I had spent years working in compliance and auditing. Rules and bylaws? That was my battlefield. The first rehook came when I discovered something by accident. The HOA wasn't just targeting me. They had done it before. I met an elderly woman down the street, Mrs. Carter, who whispered to me that they had forced her son to sell his house 2 years ago. Why? Because he was trouble. She wouldn't say more, but the way her eyes darted to the board members' houses made me realize this wasn't personal. It was a pattern. That's when I started pulling records. I filed requests for public documents, checked county property tax filings, and compared the sales history of the homes in the neighborhood. What I found nearly made me laugh out loud. Every non-compliant home that had been pushed out ended up sold at prices far below market to companies connected to board members' families. They weren't just petty tyrants, they were profiteers. But I couldn't just accuse them without proof. I needed undeniable evidence, and so I played the long game. The tension escalated. They increased their harassment, fines for leaving my car on the street, warnings for my porch light being too bright, even threats of legal action. Neighbors began avoiding me. At night, I'd catch the flicker of curtains as people peeked out when I walked by. They were afraid of the board. One night, though, everything shifted. I received an anonymous envelope slid under my door. Inside were photocopied emails between Richard, the HOA president, and a real estate broker. The subject lines were chilling. Next target, push them out, acquire cheap. And the last one was about me. That was my second hook, my turning point. They had openly written about making life unbearable for me so they could seize my property for a friendly buyer. At that moment, I knew this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about taking them down. I went full investigator. I created a timeline of their harassment, linked it to their shady property flips, and cross-referenced it with city council notes and county filings. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. Every time they had forced someone out, a relative or business partner of a board member had scooped up the property. It was systematic, organized. But then came the twist, the first betrayal. A neighbor I thought was on my side, a young couple who had nodded along whenever I spoke about the HOA, secretly reported me. I found out when Richard smugly read off details in a meeting that only they could told him. My stomach dropped. I realized the board's grip wasn't just legal, it was social. They had people under their thumb. Still, I didn't back down. Instead, I went bigger. I reached out to a local journalist. At first, she was skeptical. HOA corruption sounded too small, but when I showed her the emails, the property records, and the testimonies of former residents, she lit up. The third rehook. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. A story was brewing, one that could shatter the board's carefully crafted image, but the board caught wind, and they panicked. That week, I came home to find a notice taped to my door. Immediate foreclosure proceedings initiated. They were trying to take my home. Not next month, not next year, now. The panic in me was real, but so was the fire. I called the journalist. I handed her everything, and together, we set the trap. The article dropped like a bomb. Suburban HOA accused of property scam. The next day, news vans rolled into our quiet street. Neighbors who had been silent suddenly found their voices. Mrs. Carter cried on camera, telling her story. Former residents came forward. And the board? They scrambled, denying everything. But the evidence was too solid. The final twist came in the courtroom. I sat there, heart pounding, as the judge reviewed the evidence. The board members sat stiff, whispering to their lawyers. And then came the verdict. The foreclosure was halted, the board was dissolved, and several members were referred for criminal investigation. Richard, the man who once told me I wasn't their kind of neighbor, was led out in handcuffs. The image burned into my mind forever. Now, when I walk down the street, the fear is gone. Neighbors wave again. The air feels lighter, freer. The board's empire of control has crumbled, and my house, my mother's flowers, my porch light, my non-compliant mailbox still stands. And every time I think back to that nightmarish phrase, "not our kind of neighbor," I can't help but smile. Because in the end, I proved them right. I wasn't their kind of neighbor. I was the kind that fights back,